Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you here for this first panel of the 2022 Yale Philanthropy Conference. We get a little preview before the big kickoff at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time for this special panel. I'm so excited to have everyone here today. So today, this panel is all about enterprise capital, which is an approach to philanthropic funding that treats long-term flexible capital as high-value fuel that empowers nonprofits to fulfill their social and economic missions. So we're going to dive into what that means and how that plays out with three incredible leaders here today. I know this is going to be really fun. But first, I'll introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Davidson. I'm an SOM, or School of Management alumna. Usually we would be holding this event in person at the School of Management. So sad we can't be there today, but happy to have this platform. And I had the pleasure of working with Andrea Levier and 4 other students from the Yale School of Management on the Blueprint for Enterprise Capital. And we spent the past several years thinking about and talking to amazing leaders about how we might change these paradigms that we've been have been tired and broken around how we do funding for really high impact organizations. And I can think of no better place than the Yale Philanthropy Conference to have this discussion. We have a group of students who have really strong social justice missions and who know finance, which is just a really great combination that you don't see every day. And so we'll have about 40 minutes to talk to our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a second, and then try to save 20 minutes for your questions. So please keep thinking about it, and we'll address them as we go along if there's anything burning as well. So first up, I would love to introduce Rashmi Rangan, who is the Executive Director of the Delaware Community Reinvestment Action Council. She is a longtime nonprofit leader who's built up this organization from really grassroots and keeps on plugging away today. She'll tell you lots about what they've been up to and how they've evolved. But she's dreaming big and relying on enterprise capital as the new norm so that nonprofits can have more impact in the communities where they serve. So she'll really bring the nonprofit point of view to this discussion today. Next, we have Corey Anderson, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation in Arkansas. And so he's bringing today this foundation or funder point of view, and will be here to tell us about how he's leading the charge with the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation to take their philanthropic practices to the next level with a new statewide enterprise capital fund. And finally, we have Andrea Levier, who is the fearless leader behind Enterprise Capital. I hope you've all know her and love her, but she is the President Emerita of Prosperity Now. She's also an executive fellow at the Yale School of Management and a proud SOM alum. And she is an advisor, board member, mentor to countless nonprofits and funders, many of whom might be on this call. And so I'm really excited to have her point of view here today. So to open things up, I would love to hear from each of you about your experience with enterprise capital and what challenges it solves for you. And Andrea, since you are our fearless leader, I'd love for you to kick us off.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for everything you've done to make today possible. And I'm also going to share that this idea actually came from a pioneering nonprofit activist and philanthropist, Clara Miller, who really began the thought with philanthropic equity 20 years ago. And thankfully, good ideas come back when they're most necessary. So I'll just start this with my story as a nonprofit CEO and how, as I was raising money for my organization, I constantly came across funders who wanted to give me funding in ways that violated every rule of finance I had learned at SOM. And the nature of this capital was such that it would actually increase the operating risk of my organization, not reduce it, and not allow us to really pursue our mission, which was addressing wealth inequality. And I had a huge advantage because I had a background in finance and I knew how to argue well. And I also had a fabulous CFO who was also a nonprofit auditor who was very helpful. But what I found was so many of my colleagues did not have that background. And when it came to trying to structure this capital, had huge challenges, even though they were doing amazing work. So when I stepped down as president 2.5 years ago and was graciously offered a fellowship through the International Center for Finance in partnership with the Program for Social Enterprise, I decided that since everybody was focused on impact investing, that this was an area that we really needed to look at and see how it could help to strengthen the nonprofit sector. Suddenly COVID happened, then the call for racial equity, and the focus on the glaring disparities. And this kind of capital just rose in importance as to how this sector needed this fuel, as you called it, to really address the issues they were addressing, but also build the financial strength and resilience that was necessary in a pandemic that still is not over. So once we wrote the blueprint with the help of many nonprofits whose case studies are featured in the blueprint and real clear directions, we then began to share this with a whole set of foundations and nonprofits to really bring this idea to them, many of whom understood that philanthropy had to change, not just because of the pandemic and the call for racial equity, but because of the need to really address the disparities that their mission was focused on. So we then began to work, and Corey will talk about how that has worked with his foundation. Rashmi will talk about the role of looking at enterprise capital as a strategy to help close the racial wealth divide in the nonprofit sector. I spent my career focused on addressing the wealth divide at the household level. But what we've discovered, and what has now been very well documented, is how few organizations led by people of color have the enterprise level capital or the net assets they need to really grow and thrive. So this tool became a focus of really addressing several issues. But the last piece of it was the truth that I found when I was financing small businesses, that not many people go into business because they love finance. They go into business because they love to do what their business does. Well, that is so true of nonprofits as well. But at the same time, if you don't have some basic financial infrastructure and understanding of how capital works, both on the philanthropic side and on the nonprofit side, you really can't leverage this capital for all that it can do. And what we're also trying to frame is that this is a win-win proposition. Providing this kind of capital that goes directly on the balance sheet of nonprofits and then are used for the full range of investments they need to make, which is exactly what makes for-profit businesses so successful. That you also need some technical assistance and capacity building services to help with that. So that's the frame, that's how we've been engaged. And that's what we're hoping to expand by building a much more enterprise-friendly philanthropic sector. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Rashmi, why don't you tell us about how you've used it as a nonprofit leader?
Thank you, Elizabeth, so very much for this invitation. Andrea is an awesome teacher, and I am a pretty darn good student. My experience with enterprise capital has only been limited by the hesitancy in the philanthropy world about enterprise capital. I really hope that we change everything thing about it because it provides the nonprofits a luxury of certainty and a confidence that the organizations are set up to assure that their mission will continue to deliver effectively and efficiently. 35 years ago, Delaware Community Reinvestment Action Council, we fondly call it DCREC, was founded for the sole purpose of addressing inequities in lending. We thought we had made a lot of progress. Slow, but change is yet to come. I came to the US 34 years ago. 5 years later, God knows what people were thinking. They hired me as the executive director, one-person shop of Delaware Community Reinvestment Action Council. I thought what I was going to experience was going to be unique because I didn't know America, I didn't know nonprofits, I didn't know funders, only to realize I wasn't unique after all. For most nonprofits led by people of color, for every $2 we need, we already ask only one, and we are lucky to get 50 cents. We created the system where we undervalued ourselves. How could I be upset at philanthropy to undervalue us, right? My job primarily became raising money to keep the lights on, pay the bills, and payroll when I got. Beggars, I know, are not choosers. That brings me to what I've been doing the last 28 years, primarily utilizing this beautiful, strongest tool in our toolkit around equitable lending, Community Reinvestment Act. So I've been commenting on bank mergers, teaching folk about how to be smart money stewards of their own economic journey. When they got smart about money, where do they put that money and take advantage of opportunities? So we chartered Stepping Stones Community Federal Credit Union. Our clients took us to places we weren't ready to go. The greatest anti-poverty law policy, the earned income tax credit, brought to us the clients buried under tax debt. Thankfully, we knew how to operate the low income tax clinic. During our foreclosure crisis, we were busy untangling tangled titles so that the homeowner could show legal ownership so they could modify their mortgages. Our clients have taken us places we weren't ready. Today we are doing wills, trusts, and in this pandemic, healthcare directives. We have had tremendous impact on thousands and thousands of Delawareans and the entire state because of Community Reinvestment Act. The combined budget of DCREC and Stepping Stones, our credit union, is only $800,000 a year. Today, the credit union's core capital or retained earnings are $587,000. We have over 1,000 members. We did the Paycheck Protection Program loans as small as $2,000 and as large as $700,000. That means we can hold hands and be no different than any other banker. I thought my rest of my life will be spent writing grants, more time spending on writing reports, and somehow muddle through financially speaking. Operating grants are very small, barely enough to cover our operations. Liquidity for us dries up so quickly, we resort to lines of credit. And if you squirrel some money away for the rainy day that we all know will come one day, our funders think we don't need money. Our credit union chair is a phenomenal banker, and many years ago, he told me, Rashmi, if you raised $5 million, your grant writing days will practically be over. Music to any executive director who also happens to have to write grants. I did nothing about it because this was something I couldn't even dream until I got accepted in Prosperity Now's Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color when I met Andrea. Now, all I do is dream about this $5 million in capital campaign. Andrea has helped us craft a beautiful funding prospectus. As soon as we got that prospectus together, I took it to our mayor and I took it to our governor. By the time we were ready to take it to our governor, I knew I'll be sitting on this panel with all of you. Name dropping isn't easy for me, but who won't say Yale Philanthropy Conference? Come on. I hope somebody from the governor's office is among the 84 who are with us today. So my experience with enterprise capital has been very rich, but limited only by the hesitancy in the philanthropy community. Enterprise capital can build strong nonprofits that will continue to deliver on their missions. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Corey, I'd love to turn to you and ask you to tell us more about how you've taken new approaches to solving problems for organizations like Rashmi's and how I know you've just taken on a federal grant for this very reason, to do better by nonprofits. So please tell us more.
Sure, and I honestly, I thank you, Rashmi, and Andrea, and Yale for having me. But I'd love to hear more of Rashmi's story, right? So, one, just to say, from a philanthropic perspective, if we are really about our missions, and ours at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation is a relentless pursuit of educational equity, economic equity, social, ethnic, and racial equity for all Arkansans. We're here in Little Rock, we're an Arkansas-based funder. But universally, if we're really about those missions, then for our nonprofit partners who are actually carrying out all of the things that would get us to our missions, then certainty should not just be a luxury, right? Like the folks that are actually in the field, that are organizing communities, that are doing community development work, that are building affordable, like all of these things that add up to equity in a place. It's sort of a shame, right? That certainty feels like a luxury for our nonprofit partners. So I'll start there just to acknowledge that part of Rashmi's comments. So what we've been doing at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, and if folks hang around for another 30 minutes after this panel, you'll get to hear from our CEO, Dr. Sharice West Scantlebury, just more about what we're doing. But, over the last few years, we've done what more progressive, my word, philanthropy has done, right? We've leaned into things like trust-based philanthropy. So we've reduced the paperwork burden on our partners, both on the front end and on the back end of our grant work. We've done more general operating support grants than we've ever done in our history. We've done more technical assistance and capacity building work. So in some ways, we've done sort of all of the right things that the field has suggested are better ways to engage with our partners, to be more supportive and to kind of stay more out of their way. But when we started this conversation around enterprise capital with Andrea and others, it really sort of dawned on us that it's like enterprise capital is really the culmination, like the fruition or the actualization of what we're trying to do, right? I think one of the challenges that we've got in philanthropy in general, when you think about enterprise capital, I think the first thing people think about, is that's more money, right? Like we're going to have to be more generous than we were prior to. And what I would say is that's maybe the wrong frame, because I think enterprise capital is really not being about more generous, right? Like, because we're not doing charity work, like we're doing strategic investment work. I think enterprise capital is about being more strategic, because as Rashmi said, and I'll use your terminology, if the executive directors of the organizers, the community builders, the communicators, all of those folks that we rely, if those executive directors could have that certainty, then I think part of our idea is that obviously they could do more, they could do better, they could be more strategic, they could take more chances, they could be more innovative than they can if, as Rashmi said, if most of their work is about wondering where the next grant is going to come from. So for us, we've actually engaged in this educational process, right? Like I think lots of things that we do, both from a strategic standpoint and from a mission standpoint, are about helping people change these narratives in their mind. And I think Andrea's work, helping us to really think about enterprise capital from an internally educational standpoint, a lot of it is about helping us change the narratives that we have in our mind as philanthropic professionals, right? Andrea made the point, most of us, and I'm part of that crew, I know lots about community building. I know a little bit about communications. I was a newspaper reporter. I know a little bit about capacity building. I used to run nonprofits, so I know a little bit about that. And thank God I've got who I think is the best CFO, certainly west of the Mississippi and maybe in the whole country, because I know zero about finance, right? I can muddle my way through a balance sheet and know that things ought to add up. But these deeper questions about what nonprofits need from a financial and a capacity building standpoint, as a 20 years in philanthropy, my knowledge of that is very limited. And so a lot of what I think Andrea is helping us work through, and we want to be a model because we'll help other folks. We're a little bitty foundation. We do $5 or $6 million a year worth of grant making, and it's just right here in Arkansas. But the truth of the matter is that most of philanthropy is kind of like that. Like there's small family foundations, small place-based foundations, and our friends at Ford and Kellogg, and they're the outliers. So what we want to be is a model of how you take the inclinations that you already have, general op, technical assistance, capacity building, trust-based philanthropy, take those inclinations and actually push them to that next level.
That was great. Love to dig in a little bit deeper on what each of you is doing around incorporating enterprise capital into your work and what challenges you've had so far. Corey, why don't you start us off first?
Sure. It's interesting because it takes sort of the same process. I tell people that know me have heard this ad nauseum, but I would say you don't know the words to your favorite song the first time you hear it. This sort of move into more enterprise capital-like behavior is a lot like that. So the first thing we did was just talk to our team about what it is. And again, it's not difficult to grasp. Again, if you shift from sort of a scarcity mindset to a sort of an abundance mindset in terms of how these resources work. So it's not difficult to grasp, but we spent some time talking to our team about like what it is from a conceptual standpoint. And then we worked with Andrea and some Yale students, and I know they would love to do that for lots of people, but you don't have to have Andrea and Yale students. Like, I think you can work through some of these things yourself, right? But we really worked with them to talk to some of our other partners, to get feedback from our grantee partners about how they see, again, not the terms enterprise capital, but how they see their long-term relationship with WRS as a funder. Some of it's about how we've been in partnership with them. And then there's some real practical questions about how we funded them, right? And just to be open to how those answers come back to you, right? Rashmi, again, you use the math that I use, right? Philanthropic tradition is to say, hey, we've got this great idea. Won't you, nonprofit, help us with that idea? And then the nonprofit says, oh, absolutely, I'll help you with it. And it'll cost $2. And we say, yeah, we got 50 cents. So go find the other $1.50 if you can. And then if you can or can't, a year passes, you come back and say, hey, here's what happened. We say, gosh, that's not what we were expecting. Well, of course, it's not what we were expecting, because we didn't give you what you wanted, what you needed to actually do what everybody wanted to happen. So going through those conversations with our grantee partners, and again, being open to the answers that you get back. And we've done that over the course of, I would say, actually, we did it really quickly, which is another thing. It doesn't take years to do things, although we've got tendencies to do that in philanthropy. But in 3 or 4 months, we got 10 or 12 interviews. We had a team look at the balance sheets of our partners and actually identify specifically where the resource gaps were in these organizations. We bring that back. We re-socialize our team with it. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to begin that conversation with our board. So maybe my point is, if you're inclined that way anyway, like it shouldn't take forever. Like, there's work you got to do. Again, change your frames. You got to get smart. You, meaning the philanthropic professional, you need to get smarter about nonprofit finance as quick as you can. But also, there are lots of people to help. But I think the headline there is just getting started, right? And the truth of it is, again, most folks who consider themselves progressive philanthropists have already gotten started. They may just not know it yet.
That's great. Rashmi, how does that sound to you? I mean, from your perspective and how you're trying to incorporate enterprise capital in your work.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. And Corey, that was such a wonderful music to my ears to hear philanthropy thinking about enterprise capital, not just thinking, but doing. So thank you so much. In 2011, I had my very first experience with enterprise capital. This was $50,000 in grant funds from Catholic Campaign for Human Development and Spear Trust Commission that allowed us to charter the Community Federal Credit Union way back in 2011. Today, the capital, enterprise capital at the credit union is $587,000. And that is truly, we call it retained earnings, but it is enterprise capital that will allow the credit union self-sufficiency over a period of time. The $5 million dream that has almost become reality, thank you, Andrea, with the prospectus. We've kind of this is probably the first time we are speaking to a large audience about it. So what a perfect place to launch officially our $5 million capital campaign. Our capital campaign is not about building buildings. It is not about directly building people either. It is about building this institution that will have a continuing impact on thousands of Delawareans for years and years to come. This 5 million equity will be the foundation upon which we will build deposits, make responsible loans in our communities, loans that our communities don't have access to, which will build our communities one person at a time. And now to challenges. The first challenge is really a structural challenge. DCREC is a 501c3 nonprofit, can receive grants. Stepping Stones Community Federal Credit Union is a Federal Home Loan Bank Pittsburgh member, a certified community development financial institution, a minority depository institution serving a very distressed community in our state. It is not a 501c3, period. But I've heard any number of funders want and are seeking for MDIs, the minority depository institutions, to give to. If you're here, we are one. And if you are not, help us get in front of those who are interested in investing in MDIs. Now, how do we access equity from the capital that funders put out there that we will support capital campaigns? Take, for example, the American Rescue Plan. Millions and millions will be flowing into our municipalities. Beautiful structures will be built. They will be occupied by those who already have access to everything: health, wealth, credit, capital, you name it. Smaller nonprofits led by people of color lack social capital. So philanthropy needs to reach out of its comfort zone, get to know us and really know us. Our books don't tell our story. I have, in my 28 years of experience with the giving community, realized that philanthropy is generally too rigid, too traditional, too risk averse, and I would say somewhat complacent. In difficult economic times, we know philanthropy also suffers. It has less to give. I have yet to find a fearless leader who'll get off their assets. Its giving capacity is reduced. I mean, it would be taking risk. But isn't it during these most difficult, riskiest periods of time that we are called upon to do everyone's work? Government's work, corporations' work, philanthropy's work, and we have less and less and less resources to serve more and more and more people. I think philanthropy also needs to understand that creativity isn't about creating something brand new. It is about replicating what is working beautifully for wealthy communities into institutions that can be built into not so wealthy communities. But that replication, for example, a law firm that we run for the poor, the credit union that we run for the poor, is going to require deep, deep support. But recognize innovation means bringing something into our neighborhoods. And finally, for now only, how do we measure preventing harm? That has been a huge difficulty when we show impact. Well, these people didn't lose their homes. So thank you so much.
Let me can I jump in right before Andrea jumps in, just to say two things. One, again, Rasmi, thank you so much. WRF's first enterprise capital investments, even before we knew what the term were in CDFIs. So Southern Bancorp, Hope Community Credit Union, decades ago. And we are long-term heavy investors in both of those CDFIs that do wonderful work. So if that helps other philanthropies on the call understand, yeah, you can do that too. They don't have to be 501c3. You can figure out how to do that. And then the other thing is just to double down or lift up the question about risk, so to speak, right? Even the a shrinking endowment is not the same as a shrinking nonprofit budget. It's just not the same thing, right? Again, all of us have wonderful CFOs, investment advisors, and the like. Endowments come back, and unless you're a spin down foundation, unless you're purposely spending all of it, they come back. I think part of the challenge, again, is for us as sort of philanthropic professionals, is to continue to make the strategic case about overusing the word strategy, but continue to make the case about that these are strategic investments. They are not risky investments. These are strategic investments. There is very little risk that any foundation that is focused on growing its endowment is actually going to close its doors. Set Bernie Madoff aside, right? Like that's an instance of massive fraud that did impact lots of foundations, right? That happened. But other than that, again, in 20 years, I've never seen a foundation be so risky that all of a sudden they weren't around anymore. So just helping us to change that paradigm. It's not about risk. This is about how strategic do you want to be? And it's not about generosity. It's about how strategic do you want to be?
That was great. Andrea, I'm going to turn to you. What are you doing right now? I know you're doing a ton, so you'll have to keep it brief, but to help organizations like Rashmi's get their $5 million and then help organizations like Corey's really implement more of these innovative.
So let me start with I thought, incredibly provocative and appropriate theme that both Rashmi and Corey raised about risk. One of the big issues you study extensively in business school is risk and how you evaluate risk and all the metrics of risk. And one of the other issues that Corey was incredibly clear about is that in most cases, philanthropy has no risk. And much of it translates into reputational risk, which is addressed directly by thinking strategically, which is exactly what Corey just said. There's a metric that I raise all the time, which is called the beta. What is the systemic risk that we all face? And I think one of the things that I see all the time is a reluctance, even though there's ample resources, to invest in a certain way. So with that, we have, working with the group of Yale graduates now, we've looked very carefully at what's an influence strategy and what's a demonstration strategy. Because I think people see this on the ground and suddenly it makes so much sense. Why didn't I give a nonprofit the security to think in the future and be able to plan, not worry, as we've heard from so many interviews, about how they were going to pay payroll next month, and instead think about, how do I really support the small businesses in this community that haven't gotten the support? So how do we demonstrate the power of this capital and also help to solve this issue of what metrics really matter? So one of the great things that doing this kind of investment does is you can do a really simple financial statement analysis that doesn't take any time. And I remember back when I was in business school, there was no such thing as Excel or even Lotus 123. So using a spreadsheet was harder than just writing it down on a piece of paper. But today we can basically digitize this stuff so we can see it immediately. And that gives us the ability to really say, what is the dramatic change that Rashmi has by having equity on the balance sheet that then leverages 5 times the amount of deposits that become an ongoing sustainable source of income that funds services that she provides because the market isn't working. So thinking about this in 2 ways, how do we bring together people in philanthropy, like Corey, like Charisse, who you'll hear from later on, others who are thinking about enterprise capital, to basically share their stories with their peers, because that's of enormous influence. And then how do we look at a whole series of demonstration projects, whether it's in Arkansas or Delaware, or we're looking at a set of demonstrations with early child care centers, or working with the community progress makers of the City Foundation, who are all focused on racial equity and are being provided with grants of philanthropic equity or enterprise capital. How do we work with them to identify how do we invest this capital and move forward? And the final 2 pieces is how do we collect this data? How do we have a place where we can easily collect it? One of the things we realized in our research writing the blueprint is none of the trade associations collect data on this use of funding. They collect data on operating grants, but this is different. So if we are what we measure, although we have to write a song about that, Corey, too, that will be influential. And then finally, how do you give philanthropists who really care about this a little bit of training in finance without having to get an MBA, but just so they can understand and demystify the balance sheet and why the balance sheet's so exciting for someone who's worked in wealth inequality her whole life, right? And how do we adapt financial statements, profit and losses, for nonprofits who aren't standard businesses, but still need to understand, what do I do that makes money? What do I do that loses money? And then how do I take that argument and say, this is worth the subsidy? So those are all the pieces. And then we recruit all sorts of MBA students who want to do this.
Great. Looking forward to that, since I was one of those MBA students. I want to remind everyone we're open to questions. We love questions, so please throw those in the chat and we'll be monitoring it. But in the meantime, would love to jump into how we create an enterprise-friendly sector. Corey, maybe you can speak first about, from a funder perspective, of how does a foundation begin to change itself from these more traditional models to something like enterprise capital?
Sure. Again, I think part of our process is, in part of what Andrea did with us and on our behalf, part of that work was actually talking to other funders, beginning to, sort of broach these ideas with them. Even here in Arkansas, again, Andrea talks about sort of the fullness of time and how, this conversation feels so relevant after what we've all been through over the last 2 years, and how, if you didn't know before the pandemic and racial reckoning, how important our nonprofit sector is, you kind of know now. But so, for example, here in Arkansas, we're having a group conversation with Arkansas funders about building the capacity of the nonprofit sector in our state affinity group, Arkansas Impact Philanthropy, where all of us get together and talk about the things that concern all of us. And over the course of the pandemic and the racial reckoning, we've been able to co-fund some really high impact, important things. Together in doing that funding, we were reminded again of the capacity challenges that our nonprofits face. And I think because all of us were experiencing the same thing together, we turned the corner from, oh gosh, isn't it sad that our nonprofit partners have these capacity challenges? Oh gosh, our nonprofit partners have these capacity challenges, so that prevents us or hinders us from doing A, B, C, and D. Together, we turn the corner to, wow, there's so much potential and so much need. What can we do to help strengthen the capacity? Again, it's a narrative change in the philanthropic mind. But I think what's happening, I don't want to say happened, but what's happening here in Arkansas is at least those folks that are around this table, this collaborative table, is that we're going through that together. And again, like literally, we've got a series of conversations, and it's not just us talking to one another, right? It's actually us talking to and with our nonprofit partners. So we're not just making up stories in our mind about what their challenge and potential is. Like, we're actually listening to our nonprofit partners to better understand. And I think, and again, my guess is, again, the pandemic and et cetera, I think my guess is that may be happening in other places, that people are turning this corner away from this deficit model, right? And into sort of this asset framed way that calls on philanthropy to do differently. So I think that's probably maybe the one big thing from a field perspective. And again, in the fullness of time, WRF getting smarter, exploring, helping create some new terminologies, giving some new examples around what enterprise capital can do, is going to allow us to go into that conversation with our other partners in a way that's authentic. Like, hey, here we are. We do this maybe a little bit more than you do, but like, we're not perfect. But here's another thing. Like, we can help you not go through, 5 years of gen op capacity. Like, we can help you jump over all of that and get to the actualization of like what you really want to get to. So I think we've got that opportunity to do that here in Arkansas.
Great. We have some good questions coming in. So Rashmi, do you want to quickly tell us what you think nonprofits can do to advocate on behalf of themselves and their sector?
Nonprofits advocate, come on. But Corey, what a beautiful story you are. And if philanthropy listens and shifts a little at a time, it will not be long before we reap the benefits. Nonprofits and advocacy against the philanthropy sector is difficult. It's a fine line, delicate dance. I mean, there is such a power imbalance. We need the money. You have the money. So what do we do? When you give us money, there are strings attached, and we have to walk and do that. But I think the first step is education. And it's an education both for the nonprofit world and the philanthropy, because we are joined at the hip. There won't ever be a time when nonprofits will not need philanthropy. So education. First piece of education, of course, overheads. Payroll and other things, nonprofits shouldn't have to subsidize. So the entire cost of running an organization requires roof, lights, and people running it. Just like a personal budget, and we teach how to manage money, we talk about making sure you have liquidity, you have an emergency fund, you have longevity, and when the opportunity comes your way, you have the capacity to take advantage. So when we are building up that emergency fund, allow us to build up emergency funds. Many nonprofits had folded over because they had to use up emergency funds and the grant cycle was over and they could not reach out and get grants. I have said earlier, our source of funding will always be philanthropy, even when we create revenue generating models like the credit union or a law firm. We are supporting low wealth community, so the earnings on them will be low. We'll continue to rely on philanthropy. There is no such thing as self-sufficiency. If we could be self-sufficient, big businesses would be doing our work. And in fact, they are doing work in our communities. The payday lenders that are taking money from our communities, our businesses that are thriving and flourishing, yet a credit union that's doing everything to help our people keep money in their pockets is struggling. The other opportunity is this: we have to embrace the student-led movement. Brilliant business minds and wonderful hearts. We'd like to invite them into our fold, but not at that poverty wage badge of honor, but appropriate wage so we keep talents. A case is already made for enterprise capital. Policy. There's got to be some policy shifts. The auditing guidelines should create this enterprise capital as a line item. I know Andrea and the team have been doing great work, but we'll need to have some federal policy shifts to happen. And most of all, I think this is an opportunity. I'm more learned, and the more I learn, I say know better, do better. Now that I've learned about enterprise capital and its potential, I ought to be a strong advocate for myself, even when I am talking with our funding partners, which they are our partners.
Great. Well, Andrea, there's some good questions in the chat right now. One I'd love to make sure we cover first is someone who wants to know what the tangible differences are between GOS grants and enterprise capital. You want to cover that?
Yeah, I'll do that quick, but tell you to go to the website because we have a great question that tells exactly that. I think they're the same in spirit, but not in application. So core to enterprise capital is that it is multi-year. How many years? No specific prescription there, but it gives you that ability to plan for the future. Number two, that it is explicitly focused on going into the net assets. Some of general operating support does that, but a lot of it is just to cover the operating losses between the revenues and the expenses that a nonprofit had in an episodic way. And then the third piece is really to say, how do we provide the capacity building services customized to an organization based on its level of development and its needs and its growth strategy so that you can leverage this capital in the highest and best way? So those are the three ways that I'd say they're different. And Elizabeth, you can add to that if we missed anything.
That was great. But yes, enterprisecapital.info. If you want more info, it's there, the whole blueprint. And there's another question I'd love to get to around measuring the impact of enterprise capital. Is this necessarily an ex post facto exercise? Do we think there's other stuff we can do? What do you want to think?
Start, and then I invite both Corey and Rashmi to go further, which is, I think there's two kinds of metrics we want to look at, right? We want to be able to look at the financial condition of an organization and particularly look at not only its net assets and its unrestricted net assets, which is how it'll show up on a balance sheet, but also look at the way it's been able to invest it and how it has strengthened key metrics on the financial statements, either on the P&L or the balance sheet, that has made it more sustainable. The whole goal, as Rashmi said, is that if the market could solve the problems that we're trying to solve, it would already be doing it. So not only are we solving problems that the market can't solve, but that comes with added risk. So we need to figure out what is the sustainable financial model we had, which is a mix of different sources of funds. Then the second piece, which I think is really critical, which speaks to exactly what Corey said about strategy, is that what are the impact metrics that this kind of capital can make possible? When Clara Miller and the Nonprofit Finance Fund first advocated on behalf of this capital, it was mostly focused on scaling. What we have done in the blueprint is say there are multiple uses. We can launch new organizations or new ventures. We can stabilize organizations that have been rocked to who knows where during COVID. or we can scale initiatives or whole organizations. What are the key outcome measures that can help us determine how that works? And then the final thing I'll say is one of the things most nonprofits don't have is research capacity. So how do we bring that to the table? Several of the foundations that are profiled in the blueprint actually bring research capacity to the table. One of the great partners of Winthrop Rockefeller is the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, who is very eager to bring research capacity to be able to look at this. So I think it also thinks about who should be the partner in this and how do we leverage research capacity that we're already investing in, right, on behalf of this.
There's a really practical question in here that maybe Corey can also answer is, when you're making this shift to enterprise capital, are there legal and operational changes that need to be made? How is that process?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know yet. I feel like I don't know yet. Like we haven't gotten that far into it. But again, I think all I would say is that they are not. I could not foresee that anything of that nature would be an impediment, right? And again, it's the risk thing, right? Because again, that's like that's the question we ask ourselves. Philanthropy, that's the question philanthropy asks ourselves when we start to get nervous about doing something. Well, wait a minute, what about the IRS, or what about we ask ourselves that about like lobbying and advocacy, like that's when we start asking ourselves that question. But I don't foresee anything that would be a big enough impediment to I don't see anything that would be a big enough impediment that should stop us from moving in this direction. I'll put it that way.
One of the things that is often invoked, sorry, Rashmi, very quickly, is the Fiduciary Standard, which has been under great discussion. And I will say that Clara Miller and I had a conversation with one of the kind of most innovative professors at Yale Law School, Daniel Markovitz, to help us think through what is that really about and why are people raising that as a reason not to do innovative finance. So I think that's one of the issues, that more thinking can help open more doors. Sorry, Rashmi.
No, I was just going to say, as a nonprofit, I don't mind your money. I'll figure a way out to show that it's retained earnings over a period of time. However, having said that, I think at least for the credit union world, we are used to secondary capital, which of course NCUA has to permit, but it is an investment. It's a loan in a nonprofit that is lent for a period of time, and payback is towards the end. But that loan is made based on a plan forward, path forward. So enterprise capital could look at that model and develop its philanthropy and giving along the secondary capital model if they need something to give themselves cover.
Well, with that, we are somehow at time, which is incredible to me. I wanted to point out two quick things. We have Corey Barron and Alexandra Singh on this call, who are two other co-authors of the Blueprint on Enterprise Capital, which again, you can find with the Google search or enterprisecapital.info to learn more. They're great people to talk to as well. And following this, there'll be an optional informal networking session where you can continue to talk about these issues with other attendees. So if anyone has $5 million for Rashmi, this is a great place to start talking to her. If you want to hear more about what others are doing, please stick around for that. There'll be a link in the chat in just a moment. And wanted to thank all of you for being here, and Andrea, Rashmi, and Corey for sharing so many of your insights about this really important topic. I mean, this idea of the luxury of certainty is something that definitely stuck with me. And Corey, your quote, "You don't know the words to your favorite song before you hear it," that I'm going to use. So would invite everyone here to do just that and start talking about this issue to wider circles. That's the way you make change happen. So with that, thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth, for a terrific job. Can I just ask you one question before we go? What's your biggest takeaway from having done this?
From having done Enterprise Capital?
Yeah, from working on it. Yeah, as you think about it. I know this is unfair to throw this at you at the very last minute, so you can pass if you want. But it's just, as we inspire other students.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had been around the social impact space for a while, and I didn't understand how much finance went hand in hand with the nonprofit space until really looking at it from this perspective. So if you are a business school student, or aspiring business school student, there's a lot to be learned from things like this, and a lot of lessons you can bring from finance. I think we talked earlier about, people start businesses not because they love business, but because they see a need and they have this model, this thing that they believe in. And how true that is in nonprofit space too. And so how important the lessons are that we learn in business school, that you learn in finance courses, are to running really effective, high impact organizations.